The story of King Solomon begins long before he ever sat upon the throne of Israel. In a kingdom that had only recently discovered what it meant to be powerful, the nation of Israel had risen from tribes wandering in deserts and valleys into a united kingdom, under the rule of one of the most famous kings in ancient history, King David. David was a warrior, a poet, and a man remembered for his courage and devotion to God. He had fought giants, conquered enemies, and established Jerusalem as the heart of Israel. Yet for all his victories, David's life was marked by deep mistakes and painful consequences. His household was filled with conflict, rivalry, and ambition. And within that complicated household, a child was born who would one day become the most famous king Israel would ever know. Solomon was not the eldest son of David, nor was he the strongest or the most obvious heir to the throne. In fact, his path to power was far from certain. The palace of David was full of princes, each with supporters and ambitions. One of them, Adonijah, believed the crown rightfully belonged to him and began gathering allies to secure the throne for himself. In the ancient world, succession was rarely peaceful. Brothers turned against brothers, armies chose sides, and kingdoms often bled before a new king emerged. But Solomon's story was different, because his rise was guided by a promise. His mother, Sheba, remembered words David had once spoken, that Solomon would sit on the throne after him. When Adonijah attempted to seize power, Sheba went to the aging king and reminded him of that promise. David, weak and nearing the end of his life, acted quickly. He commanded that Solomon be placed upon the royal mule and publicly anointed as king before all Israel. The priest Zadok poured sacred oil upon Solomon's head, and the people shouted with a voice so loud that the earth seemed to tremble beneath their celebration. In that moment, Solomon became king. Yet he was still young, inexperienced, and suddenly responsible for ruling a kingdom surrounded by enemies and filled with expectations. Many kings in that position would have asked for strength, wealth, or victory in war. But Solomon would ask for something else entirely. One night, not long after he became king, Solomon traveled to the high place at Gibeon to offer sacrifices to God. There, in the silence of the night, something extraordinary happened. God appeared to Solomon in a dream and spoke words that few human beings have ever heard. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." It was an offer almost beyond imagination. A king could have asked for endless riches, invincible armies, or the destruction of every rival kingdom. Solomon could have secured power beyond measure. But Solomon did not ask for wealth. He did not ask for long life. He did not ask for victory over his enemies. Instead, Solomon answered with humility. He said that he was like a little child, inexperienced and unsure how to rule such a great people. Israel was vast, filled with countless lives depending on his leadership. And so Solomon asked for something far more valuable than gold or armies. He asked for wisdom. He asked for a discerning heart that could distinguish between right and wrong, so that he could govern the people with justice. This request pleased God deeply. Solomon had not chosen selfish gain, but the ability to serve others wisely. And so God answered in a way that would shape Solomon's entire life. God granted Solomon unparalleled wisdom, greater than any king before him or after him. But that was not all. Because Solomon had not asked for riches or honor, God decided to give him those things as well. Solomon would become not only the wisest man in the world, but also one of the richest and most powerful kings of the ancient age. What followed was a reign unlike any other in Israel's history. Solomon's wisdom quickly became legendary. One of the most famous moments early in his reign involved a dispute between two women, both claiming to be the mother of the same baby. With no witnesses and no clear evidence, the case seemed impossible to resolve. Yet Solomon proposed a shocking solution. He ordered that the baby be cut into, with half given to each woman. One woman immediately agreed, but the other cried out in desperation, begging the king to give the child to the other woman instead, just to spare the baby's life. In that moment, Solomon revealed the truth. The real mother was the one willing to give up her child to save him. The entire nation was amazed. Word spread quickly that their king possessed extraordinary wisdom. But Solomon's greatness did not stop with clever judgments. His wisdom touched every part of his rule. He organized the kingdom with remarkable efficiency, dividing responsibilities among governors and officials. He strengthened alliances with neighboring nations, bringing peace to Israel's borders. Trade flourished, wealth poured into Jerusalem, and the kingdom experienced a period of stability and prosperity rarely seen in ancient history. Solomon also became famous for his knowledge. He spoke thousands of proverbs and composed songs that people repeated for generations. He studied plants, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, observing the natural world with curiosity and insight. People traveled from distant lands simply to hear him speak. Kings and queens sent envoys carrying gifts, hoping to witness the wisdom of Israel's ruler for themselves. And at the center of Solomon's vision for Israel stood a dream his father had never been able to fulfill. David had wanted to build a great temple for God in Jerusalem, a permanent dwelling place where the people could worship. But David had been a man of war, and the task was given instead to his son. Solomon would build the temple. It would become one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world, covered in gold, cedar, and precious stones. Craftsmen from distant lands would travel to Jerusalem to help construct it. When it was finally completed, Solomon gathered the entire nation for a ceremony unlike anything Israel had ever seen. Priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the inner sanctuary. Sacrifices were offered in numbers so great they could hardly be counted. And Solomon stood before the people, lifting his hands toward heaven as he prayed that God would dwell among them and hear the prayers spoken in that sacred place. For a time, it seemed as though Solomon's reign represented the perfect union of wisdom, power, and devotion. Israel was wealthy. Its borders were secure. Its king was famous across the world. But beneath the glory of Solomon's achievements, a quiet danger was beginning to grow. Because wisdom does not always guarantee obedience, and even the wisest man who ever lived would eventually face a temptation that would slowly unravel everything he had built. Solomon's kingdom was expanding, and with expansion came alliances. In the ancient world, political alliances were often sealed through marriage. Kings married daughters of neighboring rulers to secure peace and loyalty between nations. At first, this seemed like a practical decision for Solomon. Each marriage strengthened Israel's influence and protected the kingdom from conflict. But these marriages came with a cost. Many of Solomon's wives came from cultures that worshipped different gods. And little by little, something began to change in the heart of the king who had once asked only for wisdom. The man who had built a temple for the God of Israel would soon face a test that wisdom alone could not save him from. And the consequences of that test would echo long after Solomon himself was gone. The reign of King Solomon soon became known as a golden age for the people of Israel, a time when prosperity flowed through the land like a river that never ran dry. Under his rule, the kingdom expanded its influence across trade routes that stretched far beyond the borders of Israel, connecting distant lands and cultures. Merchants traveled through the gates of Jerusalem carrying spices from Arabia, precious stones from faraway mountains, fine fabrics woven in foreign cities, and metals mined from distant deserts. Caravans of camels arrived daily, their backs heavy with wealth from lands most Israelites had never seen. Jerusalem itself began to transform before the eyes of its people. The once modest capital established by King David slowly became one of the most magnificent cities in the region. Massive walls strengthened its defenses, royal buildings rose along the hills, and the temple stood at the heart of it all, gleaming with gold that reflected the sun so brightly that travelers could see its brilliance from miles away. Solomon's palace complex alone took years to build. It was vast and impressive, filled with cedar wood imported from Lebanon and decorated with carvings of palm trees, flowers, and lions. One of its most famous halls was known as the Hall of Judgment, where the king sat upon an ivory throne overlaid with pure gold. The throne itself was unlike anything the world had ever seen. 6 steps led up to the seat of the king, and on each side of the steps stood carved lions, 12 in total, symbols of strength and authority guarding the ruler of Israel. Visitors who entered this hall often felt overwhelmed by the sight. The air was filled with the quiet presence of power. Servants moved silently across polished floors. Officials stood ready to carry out the king's commands, and the wisdom of Solomon guided decisions that affected thousands of lives across the kingdom. The wealth that flowed into Israel during Solomon's reign became legendary. Ships sailed from ports connected to the kingdom, bringing back gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks from distant lands. Every year, enormous quantities of gold were delivered to Solomon's treasury. So much silver entered Jerusalem that it became almost common, no longer treated as something rare. The abundance of riches was so great that ancient writers struggled to find words to describe it. But Solomon's reputation was not built only on wealth. His wisdom remained the true foundation of his fame. People from many nations traveled to Jerusalem hoping to witness it for themselves. They came with questions about life, leadership, philosophy, and faith, and Solomon spoke with an understanding that seemed almost beyond human ability. He shared proverbs that revealed deep truths about human nature. He spoke of patience, humility, discipline, and the dangers of pride. His teachings explored the complexities of human relationships, the struggles of the heart, and the importance of wisdom in a world often ruled by impulse and desire. Over time, his words spread far beyond Israel. Stories about the king who possessed divine wisdom traveled through caravans and royal courts across the ancient world. And eventually those stories reached the ears of one of the most powerful rulers of the time. Far to the south, in a wealthy kingdom known for its trade and spices, there ruled a queen who heard whispers of Solomon's greatness. Her kingdom was prosperous and influential, controlling routes that connected Africa, Arabia, and the ancient world. But the stories she heard about Solomon seemed almost impossible to believe. They said that a man in Jerusalem could answer the deepest questions of the human mind. They said his wisdom surpassed that of every ruler alive. They said his God had blessed him beyond measure. Curiosity began to grow in her heart, and eventually curiosity turned into determination. She decided she would travel to Israel herself and see whether the stories were true. This ruler was known as Queen of Sheba. Her journey to Jerusalem was not a simple visit. It was an expedition worthy of royalty. A massive caravan formed around her, stretching across the desert with camels loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones. The journey itself likely took weeks, crossing harsh landscapes and dangerous roads before finally reaching the hills of Jerusalem. When the Queen of Sheba arrived, the city welcomed her with the full honor reserved for powerful rulers. She entered Solomon's court not as a subject, but as a guest, bringing with her a series of difficult questions designed to test the king's wisdom. Ancient traditions describe these questions as riddles, philosophical challenges meant to reveal whether Solomon's reputation was truly deserved. One by one, she presented her questions, and one by one, Solomon answered them. Nothing seemed to confuse him. No riddle remained unsolved. No philosophical puzzle left unanswered. The queen watched as Solomon spoke with calm confidence, explaining truths about life and understanding the deeper meaning behind every challenge she presented. But it was not only Solomon's wisdom that astonished her. She observed his kingdom closely. She saw the organization of his court, the discipline of his servants, the elegance of his palace, and the beauty of the temple built for the God of Israel. She saw the wealth of the kingdom, the peace that surrounded its borders, and the respect shown to Solomon by his people. Everything she witnessed exceeded the stories she had heard. Eventually, she spoke words that would become famous in the ancient world. She told Solomon that the reports she had heard in her own land were true, yet they had not fully prepared her for what she was now seeing. In fact, she said the reality was even greater than the stories. She praised the wisdom given to Solomon and acknowledged that his God must truly favor him, placing him on the throne of Israel because of divine love for the people. As a gesture of respect, the Queen of Sheba presented Solomon with enormous gifts. She offered vast quantities of gold, rare spices, and precious stones, treasures worthy of a powerful king. Solomon in return gave her many gifts of equal generosity before she returned to her homeland. Her visit only strengthened Solomon's reputation. If even a powerful queen had traveled across deserts to witness his wisdom, then surely the stories about him must be true. For many years, Solomon's reign continued in this spirit of greatness. Israel lived in peace, its people enjoying safety and prosperity. Farmers worked fertile lands without fear of invasion. Trade expanded across borders. The kingdom grew richer with each passing season. And Solomon himself seemed to stand at the very peak of human achievement. He possessed wisdom beyond measure. He ruled one of the most prosperous kingdoms of his time. His fame reached distant nations. His temple stood as a symbol of devotion to God. Yet within this extraordinary success lay a subtle and dangerous shift, one that unfolded slowly over time. Because power and prosperity often carry temptations that grow quietly, almost unnoticed, Solomon's alliances with foreign nations continued to increase. Each treaty strengthened Israel's position in the region, securing peace through diplomacy rather than war. And in the political traditions of the ancient world, these alliances were often sealed through marriage. Solomon began marrying the daughters of foreign kings. At first, these marriages seemed like wise political decisions. Each one secured friendship with another kingdom, reducing the likelihood of conflict and expanding Israel's influence. But the number of these marriages continued to grow, and with each new marriage, something began to change within the heart of the king who had once asked only for wisdom. Because these foreign wives did not leave their cultures behind when they entered Israel, they brought their traditions with them. They brought their beliefs, and most importantly, they brought their gods. At the beginning, these differences may have seemed harmless. Solomon remained the king who built the temple for the God of Israel. He continued to lead the nation with wisdom and authority, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, compromises began to appear. The man who had once prayed with humility before God began allowing influences that his own laws warned against. Years passed. Solomon's household grew larger. More wives arrived from distant lands. More foreign traditions entered the palace, and somewhere along the path of success, the king who possessed unmatched wisdom began drifting toward a danger that wisdom alone could not prevent. Because even the wisest man in the world can lose his way when his heart begins to turn. And the choices Solomon would soon make would not only affect his own life, they would shape the future of an entire kingdom. The golden age of Israel had reached its peak, but the shadow of decline was already beginning to form. As the years passed, the life of King Solomon continued to grow more magnificent on the surface. Yet beneath the brilliance of wealth and achievement, something far more fragile was beginning to weaken. The same king who had once stood before God in humility, asking only for wisdom so that he might lead the people with justice, slowly began to surround himself with influences that would quietly reshape the direction of his heart. At first, the changes were subtle. They appeared almost harmless, the natural consequences of ruling a kingdom connected to many nations. Solomon's alliances had strengthened Israel's position in the region, bringing peace through diplomacy rather than war. The ancient world was filled with rulers who secured peace through marriage, and Solomon followed the same path. One royal marriage turned into several marriages turned into dozens, and over time, the number became something that few could have imagined. The king of Israel eventually took hundreds of wives and concubines from surrounding nations. Many of them were daughters of foreign rulers, women raised in cultures that worshipped gods very different from the God of Israel. They came from places where people bowed before idols of stone and wood, offering sacrifices to deities believed to control fertility, war, harvest, and fortune. The law of Israel had warned about this very thing. Long before Solomon's time, the people had been instructed not to allow their hearts to turn toward the gods of surrounding nations. They were told that foreign influences could slowly pull them away from their devotion to the one true God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt and led them through the wilderness. But Solomon, despite all his wisdom, allowed these warnings to fade into the background of his life. His palace grew larger with each passing year, filled with wives from different cultures, each carrying traditions, beliefs, and expectations from their homeland. And as time moved forward, these influences began to shape the atmosphere within the royal household. One of the most dangerous realities about spiritual compromise is that it rarely happens all at once. It begins with small allowances, small decisions that seem unimportant in the moment. A king might permit a foreign wife to maintain a shrine for the god she had worshipped since childhood. At first it might seem like a gesture of kindness, a way of honoring political alliances and preserving peace within the royal household. But kindness slowly turns into permission. Permission slowly turns into participation. And before long, the line between devotion and compromise begins to disappear. As Solomon grew older, the scriptures tell us something deeply tragic. His wives turned his heart after other gods. The king who had once dedicated the temple in Jerusalem to the God of Israel began allowing worship of foreign deities to take place within the land he ruled. He permitted the construction of altars and high places where sacrifices were offered to gods worshipped by neighboring nations. These gods had names that would have been familiar to the foreign women within Solomon's palace, but deeply troubling to those who remembered the commands given to Israel. Among them were deities such as Molech and Ashtoreth, gods connected to practices that stood in direct opposition to the faith of Israel. These were not simply different religious traditions. They represented systems of worship that often involved cruelty, exploitation, and rituals far removed from the covenant that Israel had been called to follow. And yet Solomon allowed them. The man whose wisdom had once amazed kings and queens began to drift into spiritual confusion. It is one of the most haunting paradoxes in ancient history. The wisest man in the world slowly losing sight of the truth he once understood so clearly. The shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded over many years, quietly and gradually. Solomon still ruled with intelligence. His kingdom remained wealthy and influential. The temple in Jerusalem still stood as a symbol of Israel's devotion to God. But beneath the surface, the spiritual center of the kingdom had begun to fracture. Solomon himself, the king chosen by God and blessed with unparalleled wisdom, had begun to follow the desires of his heart rather than the commands he once honored. And this change did not go unnoticed. The scriptures describe the moment with simple but powerful words. The Lord became angry with Solomon. This anger was not the sudden rage of a ruler offended by disobedience. It was the deep sorrow of a covenant broken by someone who had once been entrusted with extraordinary responsibility. Solomon had been given wisdom beyond measure, blessings beyond imagination, and a kingdom stronger than any Israel had known before. Yet despite all of this, He allowed his heart to drift toward influences that slowly pulled him away from the path he had once walked. God had appeared to Solomon twice during his life, offering guidance and blessing. Solomon had experienced divine favor in a way few human beings ever had. But the king who once listened with humility now seemed to follow his own desires. Because of this, a judgment was spoken over his kingdom. God declared that the kingdom would be torn apart. Israel, once united under a single throne, would eventually be divided. The prosperity and unity Solomon had built would not last forever. However, the consequences would not fall entirely during Solomon's lifetime. Because of the promise God had made to King David, the complete division of the kingdom would come later, during the reign of Solomon's son. But the process had already begun. Opposition slowly started to rise against Solomon. Enemies appeared along the borders of Israel. Men who had once remained silent during the kingdom's years of strength. Among them were leaders who began challenging Solomon's authority, sensing that the unity of his rule was beginning to weaken. One of the most significant figures to emerge during this time was a man named Jeroboam. He was not a foreign enemy, but an official within Solomon's own administration. Jeroboam was capable, ambitious, and respected among the workers of the kingdom. One day a prophet encountered Jeroboam on the road and delivered a message that would change the future of Israel forever. The prophet took a new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. He handed 10 of those pieces to Jeroboam and explained the meaning behind the act. Just as the cloak had been torn apart, so the kingdom of Israel would one day be divided. 10 tribes would break away from the house of Solomon, leaving only a small portion of the kingdom under the rule of David's descendants. The reason given for this future division was clear. Solomon had turned away from the God who had lifted him to power. When Solomon learned about Jeroboam and the prophecies surrounding him, the king attempted to stop the rising threat. Jeroboam fled for safety to Egypt, where he remained until the end of Solomon's life. Yet even with these warnings and signs of coming trouble, Solomon's story continued moving toward its inevitable conclusion. The man who once stood as the greatest king of Israel now lives surrounded by wealth, influence, and complexity, yet the simplicity of his early devotion had faded. The wisdom that had once defined his rule remained part of his legacy, preserved in proverbs and teachings that people would read for centuries. But wisdom, when separated from obedience, cannot fully protect a person from the consequences of their choices. The golden age of Israel slowly began to dim. The kingdom still looked powerful to the outside world, but its spiritual foundation had weakened. The king who had once built a temple for God had also allowed altars for other gods to rise within the land. It was a tragic contrast. Solomon had reached heights of success that few rulers in history have ever matched. He had built wonders, guided a nation to prosperity, and spoken wisdom that echoed across generations. Yet the same life that began with humility and devotion was now marked by compromise and quiet decline. And somewhere in the final years of his reign, Solomon himself likely began to recognize the emptiness that can hide behind greatness. When the heart loses its direction, because wisdom can reveal the truth about the world, but only faithfulness can preserve it. And the story of Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, was slowly approaching its final chapter, a chapter that would leave behind one of the most powerful lessons ever recorded in the history of kings. As the years continued to pass, the once brilliant reign of King Solomon slowly moved toward its final chapter. The man who had once stood before God as a humble young king now lived surrounded by unimaginable wealth, enormous palaces, and a kingdom that had known decades of prosperity. Yet time has a way of revealing truths that success often hides. In the early years of his reign, Solomon had been known for clarity. His decisions were sharp, his heart attentive, and his desire to rule wisely guided everything he did. But in the later years of his life, the world he had built around himself began to feel different. The same palace that once symbolized triumph now stood as a reminder of how far he had drifted from the simplicity of his beginning. Jerusalem was still magnificent. The temple still stood as one of the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. Gold still filled the treasuries. Traders still passed through the city gates. From the outside, the kingdom appeared stable, powerful, and blessed. But inside the heart of the king, something had changed. Solomon had seen more of life than almost any man who had ever lived. He had studied wisdom, wealth, pleasure, leadership, and power. He had observed the rise and fall of men. He had watched how ambition shaped kingdoms, and how desire could corrupt even the strongest rulers. And perhaps more than anyone else in history, Solomon understood that the things people chase most passionately often fail to satisfy them. Many scholars believe that during the later years of his life, Solomon began reflecting deeply on everything he had experienced. The man who once wrote thousands of proverbs may have begun asking harder questions about the meaning of life itself. These reflections are often associated with one of the most philosophical writings in the ancient world, the book known as Ecclesiastes. The voice within Ecclesiastes speaks like an aging king, looking back over the path he has traveled. It describes someone who has tasted every form of success and pleasure, yet still finds himself asking whether any of it truly lasts. The writer speaks about wisdom, yet also recognizes that wisdom alone cannot prevent sorrow. He speaks about wealth, yet observes that riches eventually pass into the hands of someone else. He speaks about hard work, ambition, and achievement, yet notes that generations rise and fall while the world continues unchanged. The message echoes through the text like a quiet confession. Everything under the sun is temporary. Everything fades. Power fades. Fame fades. Even the greatest kingdoms eventually crumble into memory. For a man like Solomon, who had experienced more success than most kings could ever dream of, these realizations must have carried enormous weight. The golden halls of his palace, the gold-covered throne, the gardens and treasures he had gathered from distant lands, all of them stood as monuments to a life that had reached incredible heights. Yet none of them could stop time. None of them could restore the devotion he once had as a young king standing before God at Gibeon. As Solomon aged, the kingdom he ruled also began to feel the pressure of the enormous system he had created. His building projects had been vast and expensive. Palaces, fortifications, and trade networks required immense labor and resources. The prosperity of Israel had come with heavy demands placed upon the people who worked to maintain it. These pressures would later contribute to unrest among the tribes of Israel, especially after Solomon's death. But during the final years of his reign, the king himself remained on the throne, a figure both legendary and complicated. The man who had once amazed the world with his wisdom now stood as a reminder that wisdom alone does not protect a person from their own choices. Solomon ruled Israel for 40 years, for decades of power, for decades of wealth, for decades during which the nation reached the height of its influence, and eventually, like every ruler before him, Solomon reached the end of his life. The Bible does not record dramatic final speeches or great battles surrounding his death. Instead, the account ends quietly, almost solemnly. The king who had once been visited by foreign queens and surrounded by riches beyond imagination simply passed from the world like every other human being. He was buried in the city of his father, city of David, the same city that had witnessed both the triumphs and the failures of Israel's greatest kings. After Solomon's death, the throne passed to his son Rehoboam. But the unity of the kingdom would not survive long after Solomon was gone. The tensions that had grown during his reign quickly erupted into conflict. The tribes of Israel demanded relief from the heavy burdens placed upon them. When their requests were ignored, the kingdom fractured. 10 tribes separated from the rule of Solomon's family and formed a new kingdom in the north. The once united kingdom of Israel was divided forever. And, in many ways, that division became the final echo of Solomon's choices. The king who had built the greatest kingdom Israel ever knew had also set the stage for its division. His wisdom had built a golden age, but his compromises had weakened its foundation. Yet despite the tragic elements of his story, Solomon's life remains one of the most fascinating and powerful narratives in ancient history. His wisdom continues to shape moral teaching thousands of years later. His proverbs are studied across cultures. His reflections about life, success, and meaning still resonate with readers who struggle with the same questions he once asked. Because Solomon's story is not only about a king, it is about the human condition. It is about the strange truth that a person can possess extraordinary intelligence, yet still struggle to follow the path they know is right. It is about how success can quietly reshape priorities, and it is about how even the greatest achievements cannot replace a heart that remains faithful. The young king who once asked God for wisdom had started his journey with humility. He had ruled with brilliance. He had built wonders that astonished the world. But his life also became a warning, a reminder that wisdom must be protected by discipline, that power must be guided by faithfulness, and that the greatest danger for those who rise to the top is not always defeat by enemies, but the slow drift of their own hearts. In the end, the story of King Solomon leaves us with a question that echoes across centuries. What is the true value of wisdom, wealth, and power if they are not anchored to something eternal? Solomon himself may have answered that question best in the reflections attributed to him. After exploring every path life could offer: pleasure, success, knowledge, ambition, he arrived at a conclusion both simple and profound. The meaning of life is not found in chasing everything the world can give. It is found in remembering the one who gave life in the first place. And perhaps that is why the story of Solomon continues to be told. Not only because he was the wisest king who ever lived, but because he was also a man who discovered, too late, that wisdom without faithfulness can still lead a person to lose everything.